The hero of our story entered the ancient chronicles under the resounding title of Callinicus, which translates to glorious victor. Sounds majestic, doesn't it? The imagination immediately conjures up an invincible warlord atop a war elephant, sweeping away the enemy formation. However, reality is paradoxical. Over his 21 years of rule, an era spanning the coming of age of an entire generation, this triumphant conqueror lost almost all of his decisive battles. He squandered half of a great empire, ignited the bloodiest civil war of the Hellenistic age, and on one occasion had to run for his life, hiding beneath the blood-soaked rags of a murdered servant. Previously, we observed how this colossal geopolitical mechanism was forged. Seleucus I Nicator wrested the right to rule from the desert, armed with a mere 500 horsemen. The wise Sogdian noblewoman Apama bound the lands together through diplomacy, integrating the eastern elites. Their successor, Antiochus I Soter, shielded civilization from the barbarian Celts with the sheer force of 16 Indian elephants. Their domains stretched across 3 million square kilometers, an area larger than modern-day India. The foundation seemed eternal, but history does not tolerate complacency. The heirs of these titans imagined that the world was held together not by steel and willpower, but by signatures on treaties and whispers in palace chambers. This fatal illusion pushed them straight into the abyss. By 246 BC, a perfect storm had engulfed the Seleucid Empire. The sudden death of Antiochus II triggered a chain reaction of disasters unprecedented in the ancient world. Young Seleucus II inherited not a shining throne, but a house engulfed in flames, its gates being battered down by both foreign enemies and his own kin. He would have to withstand the onslaught of the Egyptian military machine, survive the betrayal of his own brother, and face a new wave of savage mercenaries. Today, we are setting aside high philosophy in favor of the cynical logic of survival. Before our eyes, the tragedy in the sacred grove of Daphne will come to life, where the spilling of a woman's blood provoked an Egyptian juggernaut that literally crushed Asia. You will see how a 14-year-old grinds battle-hardened imperial legions into dust. We will walk the path of a king who lost absolutely everything, just to uncover a paradox. Why did the survivors name the greatest loser of the dynasty the glorious victor? And how did the greatest disgrace of his life become the only chance to save the empire from complete oblivion? We begin our descent into the darkest period of the dynasty. In 261 BC, Antiochus I Soter passed away, the ruler who had saved the empire from barbarians at the cost of great sacrifices. Shortly before his departure, the sovereign was forced to execute his own eldest son for treason. The throne, steeped in blood and paranoia, passed to the spare heir, Antiochus II. The new sovereign quickly proved that he possessed the iron grip of his ancestors. After dispatching the tyrant of the city of Miletus, he received the resounding title of Theos, which means God, from the grateful Greeks. Antiochus II had no intention of sitting on the defensive. Unleashing the Second Syrian War, he successfully drove the Ptolemaic forces out of Asia Minor. It seemed this god was invincible on the battlefield. However, the commander who knew no defeat by the sword walked right into a trap at the negotiating table. By 246 BC, the king decided to end the exhausting conflict through a political compromise. Accepting the terms of Ptolemy II, he executed a fatal dynastic maneuver. Antiochus officially repudiated his first wife, the influential Macedonian noblewoman Laodice, and exiled her to Asia Minor along with her sons. In her place, the Egyptian princess Berenice Sira entered the palace. the new queen arrived in Antioch with a dowry so enormous that her contemporaries nicknamed her Phalanx, the bearer of the dowry. The monarch sincerely believed in the genius of his move. He hoped to balance between the superpowers, relying on Egyptian gold and the loyalty of the old elites. In reality, Antiochus had personally planted explosives beneath the foundation of his own house. By underestimating the pride of his banished wife, he made a fatal mistake. Leaving Berenice and their newborn son in the capital, the ruler traveled to Ephesus, in her lair. There, far from his loyal bodyguards, the king suddenly died. Ancient historians had no doubts. A poisoned chalice put an end to the story of their marriage. The death of the monarch created a situation of extreme vulnerability for the entire empire. Laodice fully realized that the clock was ticking. Should news of the death reach the capital, the Egyptian faction would immediately elevate Berenice's infant to the throne. The queen needed time to secure the crown for her 19-year-old son, Seleucus. And so she orchestrated one of the most cynical theatrical performances in history. On her orders, her husband's body was immediately hidden. A man named Artemon was brought from the city slums, a commoner who possessed a mystical, spitting image resemblance to the deceased ruler. Laodice placed the doppelganger in the royal bed, drew the curtains, and let the highest dignitaries in. Artemon played his one and only role brilliantly. In a weak, trembling voice, he wheezed out his final will. The empire and the diadem were to pass to Seleucus. The witnesses obediently bowed their heads. Soon after, the fake king died, vanishing from the chronicles forever. Armed with a legitimate pretext, Laodice struck first. A pre-planned mutiny erupted in Antioch. Berenice, finding herself in the center of a hostile city, instantly realized the scale of the threat. Together with her son and a handful of Galatian mercenaries, she barricaded herself in Daphne, the sacred grove of Apollo. In those days, shedding blood in a sanctuary was considered an unthinkable sacrilege. Berenice desperately sent messengers to Alexandria, begging her brother, Pharaoh Ptolemy III, for help. But the assassins, driven by Laodice's will, cast aside their fear of the gods. They burst into the sacred grove. The guards fell. The mercenaries tore the infant from her mother's arms and snuffed out his life. A moment later, their daggers cut short the path of the princess herself. Behind this monstrous sacrilege lay not banal jealousy, but the cold calculation of a strategist. The queen understood the brutal mathematics of the era. As long as the Egyptian heir drew breath, her own children remained living targets. Either she burned the threat to the ground, or the Egyptian legions would destroy her family. Laodice chose the former. Washing her hands in blood, she placed the diadem on the head of young Seleucus II and snapped the trap of power shut. It seemed to her that the game was won. The rivals were dead, the throne was secured, and the empire had submitted. But the triumph proved to be an illusion. The blood spilled in the sacred grove did not fortify the palace walls. It became the bait for the most dangerous predator in the Mediterranean. The Egyptian lion had awakened. His fleet had already hoisted its sails, and it was moving east, not for land. He thirsted for total vengeance. The Third Syrian War, which historians would come to call the Laodicean War, did not break out over borders. The flames were ignited by spilled women's blood. Ptolemy III, the ruler of Egypt, whom we discussed earlier in our series on the Ptolemaic dynasty, hurled his colossal military machine to the east to exact revenge for his sister. The campaign proved to be truly devastating. To fully grasp the depth of the catastrophe, let's look at a unique document, the Ghurab Papyrus. Before us is not just a chronicle, but the personal field diary of the Egyptian sovereign. The text records not fierce battles, but a triumphant march. Ptolemy's fleet reaches Seleucia Perea, the main imperial port, and the impregnable citadel voluntarily hands over its keys. The troops march into Antioch. The citizens, who only yesterday swore their allegiance to Laodice, welcome the invader with a rapturous roar. 19-year-old Seleucus II, the nominal master of a gigantic empire, does not lead his phalanxes onto the field. He vanishes without a trace. The young ruler hides in the mountains of Anatolia, watching helplessly as the enemy juggernaut grinds his inheritance to dust. The heir believed that the crown granted absolute authority, but reality taught him a brutal lesson. An empire bows not to a title, but to brute force, a force he simply did not possess. The pharaoh's regiments cover hundreds of kilometers unhindered and cross the Euphrates. The march from Antioch to Babylon is comparable to trekking from Paris to Rome across a scorching desert. But in the ancient Mesopotamian capital, this easy stroll is abruptly cut short. Greek chroniclers would try to convince their descendants that the eastern lands fell without a single blow being struck. However, cuneiform tablets known today as the Babylonian Chronicles paint an entirely blood-drenched picture. The locals viewed the newcomers not as liberators, but as sacrilegious defilers. The text contemptuously refers to the invaders as Haenian troops who do not fear the gods. Fierce urban warfare erupts on the city streets. Picture this scene. Bronze-clad hoplites hack their way through tight mud brick quarters. People flee in panic toward the palace, but their pursuers mercilessly cut them down right on the steps of the ziggurats. The besieged Seleucid garrison, remaining loyal to their fugitive monarch, locks the citadel gates tight. The defenders hold a perimeter defense, repelling siege engine attacks and raining javelins down upon the enemy. Mesopotamia is choking in its own blood, but it refuses to surrender. And in this moment of absolute knife-edge tension, the inexplicable happens. Ptolemy III, having raised his sword right over the neck of the Seleucid dynasty, suddenly orders the retreat to be sounded. The invincible army breaks camp and hastily marches back home. Now let's break down the reasons for such a hasty flight. Propaganda wove an elegant myth around this event. The king's wife, Berenice, supposedly sacrificed her luxurious locks to the temple of Aphrodite for his safe return. The locks vanished from the altar, and the astronomer Conan immediately discovered them in the heavens, and thus the constellation Coma Berenici, or Berenice's hair, was born. But behind this poetic facade hid absolute economic collapse. In Egypt, the Nile had failed to flood. Famine gripped the country, and a furious popular uprising ignited. Fearing to lose his own throne, the pharaoh abandoned his conquered lands. Seleucus II reclaimed his capital and eastern provinces without a single pitched battle. The enemy simply dissolved into the sands. Appreciate this historical paradox. The young ruler was saved not by his own military genius, but by the whim of a river. It seemed the state had survived, but barely having shaken off the external threat, the monarch made a decision that tore the empire in two. Desperate to hold on to his vast territories, he turned for help to the one person he naively trusted. This move would become a fatal mistake. A fratricidal conflict erupted at the exact moment when the empire desperately needed stability. Even at the height of the war with Egypt, attempting to hold the western frontiers, Seleucus II resorted to extreme measures. He entrusted the administration of Asia Minor to his younger brother, Antiochus, who was barely 14 years old at the time. The monarch calculated that handing power over to a blood relative would secure his rear and unite the family in the face of an external threat. In reality, the ambitious teenager, who had earned the nickname Hierax, the Hawk, immediately declared himself an independent king. The irony of the situation is stunning in its cynicism. The queen mother, Laodice, who had orchestrated the murder of her rival and poisoned her husband to place Seleucus on the throne, now openly supported her younger son, bankrolling his rebellion against the elder. For the domineering woman, the young prince became the perfect puppet through which she planned to single-handedly rule the richest region of the empire. The first full-scale civil war in the history of the Hellenistic East broke out. Seleucus, gathering the veterans of the Syrian and Babylonian campaigns, crossed the Taurus Mountains to teach the rebel a bloody lesson. Around 239 BC, the two armies clashed near the city of Ancyra, modern-day Ankara. Imagine this panorama from a bird's-eye view. Before us lies the vast Anatolian plateau, where the fate of a colossal state is being decided. The camera zooms in, and we see the crisp, bronze-clad rectangles of the Macedonian phalanx, the absolute elite of the civilized world. But lined up opposite them is not a mirror image of a Greek army. The rebel brother has brought with him tens of thousands of Galatians, savage Celtic mercenaries who had recently settled in the center of the peninsula. Look closely at them. Bare torsos covered in blue war paint, hair spiked stiff with lime, unleashing an animalistic primal howl. At the very epicenter of the clash, the Celts do not even attempt to maneuver. They literally impale themselves on the 6-meter sarissas of the Seleucid infantry, desperate to get into close-quarters combat. Heavy, slashing swords chop right through the shafts of the spears and smash open the bronze shields. The discipline of the regular army cracks and shatters under the sheer pressure of this barbaric frenzy. Around 20,000 imperial soldiers were slaughtered in this meat grinder. To fully grasp the scale of the catastrophe, such a loss doesn't just bleed an army dry, it is comparable to the instant annihilation of the entire population of a major ancient metropolis. Why did an experienced ruler suffer such a crushing defeat at the hands of a 14-year-old teenager? Hierax prevailed because he completely discarded the rules of Macedonian warfare. He didn't buy soldiers, he bought absolute terror that ignored tactics and battlefield etiquette. Seleucus found himself completely unprepared for a war of total annihilation. Realizing that the battle is lost and his elite guard has been butchered, the legitimate king of half of Asia commits an unthinkable act for a proud monarch. He throws off his precious purple cloak. With trembling hands, the ruler strips the blood-soaked rags from a murdered servant, changes clothes, and under the cover of night, flees the battlefield on foot, vanishing into the wild forests. However, Antiochus's triumph was short-lived. The Galatian mercenaries, casting their eyes over the mountains of corpses from the Seleucid army, suddenly realized something. They had just destroyed the only force capable of keeping them in check. Why serve a mere boy when they could take the entirety of Asia Minor for themselves? The Celts turn their weapons against their employer, and he is forced to run for his life from his very own allies. The catastrophe at Ancyra left the region in ruins. The imperial army simply ceased to exist. The rightful king was hiding in the woods dressed as a slave, while the traitorous prince was fleeing from his very own legions of death. The richest lands plunged into a power vacuum, left to be torn apart by barbarians. But history abhors a vacuum. In this moment of utter hopelessness, an entirely new, quiet power steps into the arena, one that the Seleucids didn't even suspect existed. This power would permanently alter the political map of the world. The defeat at Ancyra created a perfect power vacuum in Asia Minor. Seleucus II had lost his army and fled, while his brother, Antiochus the Hawk, ended up a hostage to his own Galatian mercenaries. The wealthiest region of the ancient world lay in ruins, waiting for a new claimant to the crown. And such a man was found. He did not belong to a great dynasty, nor did he rule from a lavish capital. His power was limited to the tiny coastal town of Pergamum by the Aegean Sea. The name of this daring man was Attalus I. Let's assess the balance of power on the political map of that era. For decades, the Diadochi had been paying humiliating tributes to the wild Celts, protecting their lands from fire and pillage. Antiochus the Hawk had gone as far as making the barbarians his primary striking force. However, the ruler of Pergamum decided to shatter the established order. He flatly refused to buy peace from the raiders. When the enraged Galatians marched on his city, Attalus led out his small but flawlessly trained units and thoroughly routed the enemy. This victory shocked the Greek world. The young monarch achieved what had proven impossible for the heirs of Alexander the Great. Right there on the battlefield, he proclaimed himself king and took the title Soter, the Savior. The fate of Antiochus the Hawk, however, took a tragic turn. The ambitious prince, who had fractured the empire for dominance over Asia, found the lands slipping through his fingers. Attalus I unleashed the full might of his army upon him. In a series of relentless clashes, Pergamum drove the rebel out of all his domains. Yesterday's lord of the West fled to Armenia, then unsuccessfully attempted to invade Mesopotamia, only to fall under the blows of the forces of his own uncle, Andromachus. The finale of the Hawk is steeped in cruel irony. The commander of legions numbering in the tens of thousands, hiding in Thrace, stumbled upon a gang of Celtic robbers. They, totally unaware of their victim's royal status, butchered him on a dusty road for the sake of a few gold coins. Thus ended the inglorious life of the man who pushed his own family to the very brink of extinction. While Seleucus II might have celebrated his brother's downfall, a disaster of an entirely different magnitude was unfolding on the other side of the world. 15 years of infighting and chaos had bled the border regions dry. Let's fast forward to Central Asia. Formally, the Seleucid domain still stretched from Syria to India, but reality had long since shifted. Bactria, in the territory of modern-day Afghanistan, declared independence under the leadership of the satrap Daphne, and even closer to the center of the empire, in Parthia, a nomadic chieftain named Arsaces annihilated the local satrap and laid the foundation for a new, predatory state. The king realized that without reclaiming the East, the empire would turn into a pathetic stump. Around 230 BC, he rallied his veterans and embarked on a grand campaign against the Parthians. Ancient chroniclers diverge in their descriptions of this campaign. The Roman historian Justin claims that Seleucus suffered a catastrophic defeat and fell into shameful captivity. Other sources, on the contrary, speak of a victory over Arsaces and his subsequent flight into the steppes. However, at the critical moment, news of fresh rebellions arrives from Syria, orchestrated by none other than his own sister, Stratonice. The monarch was forced to turn his phalanxes around and depart, forever leaving Parthia and Bactria under the rule of their new masters. The rightful ruler returned to Antioch aged and broken. Asia Minor now belonged to Pergamum. The boundless East fell to nomadic kings. Of the once colossal realm of 3 million square kilometers, only Syria and Mesopotamia remained. Seleucus rode home, expecting nothing but new conspiracies and a dagger in the back from yet another relative. But the resolution to this 20-year drama turned out to be more absurd and terrifying than any palace coup. By 225 BC, Seleucus II suddenly finds himself the sole survivor in this multi-year Game of Thrones. The Egyptian phalanxes have long since left his lands. His domineering, conspiracy-weaving mother has been eliminated. His traitorous brother is feeding the crows in Thrace. The king masses fresh regiments, rebuilds the exhausted economy, and prepares to unleash his full fury upon the upstart Attalus of Pergamum. The monarch believed he had survived his own personal hell and was ready to launch an era of triumphant conquests. But the finale of this story proved more absurd and horrific than any expectation. During an equestrian review, the 40-year-old ruler's horse stumbles at a full gallop. The king is thrown from the saddle and, with a sickening crunch, breaks his neck. The man who survived a hail of Egyptian arrows and lived through the Galatian meat grinder dies from a freak accident on a flat field. And herein lies the grand mystery of our episode. Why did the army and ancient chroniclers bestow the magnificent title of Callinicus, the glorious victor, upon this monarch? After all, the dry facts are utterly merciless. Asia Minor is lost, boundless Bactria has slipped away, and the eastern steppes are occupied by the Parthians. Is this really what a triumph looks like? Let's try to dissect the true mechanics of his reign. Seleucus II possessed neither the genius of Alexander nor the cunning of his great-grandfather Nicator. Yet he was the one who won the most grueling game of the era, a total war of attrition. The reins of power were handed to him at the precise moment of the empire's clinical death. To rule the empire in 246 BC meant holding the wheel of a blazing ship while pirates were boarding and a bloody mutiny was brewing in the hold. The state was struck by 3 global blows simultaneously: the Egyptian invasion, the separatism of the satrapies, and a full-scale civil war. In Seleucus's place, any other ruler would have simply given up, surrendered the capital, or chosen voluntary exile. But this king demonstrated inhuman stubbornness. Sinking his teeth into his slipping power, he hid in the forests in the rags of a slave, retreated and lost armies, but he never surrendered. By surviving against all odds, he preserved the political core of the system, Syria and Babylonia. His glorious victory was the very fact that he kept the colossal Seleucid mechanism on the map of the world. To his heirs, he passed down not a pile of ashes, but a viable, albeit diminished, state. Seleucus II took the reins of power during an epoch of global collapse, withstood the onslaught of the Egyptian juggernaut, survived a crushing rout at the hands of the Celts, and lost the boundless eastern provinces. But the truth is paradoxical. It was exactly the monarch's inhuman stubbornness that prevented this colossal machine from collapsing entirely, locking the Syrian core of the state tightly together. This exposes a merciless law of history. The true greatness of a ruler is measured not by the square mileage of his new conquests, but by the depth of the catastrophe he managed to overcome while keeping the crown on his head. The empire would be saturated with this strategy of survival on the edge of the abyss, right up until its inevitable collision with Rome. However, peace proved to be merely a brief respite. The death of Seleucus passed the throne to his eldest son, whose life would soon be cut short by the blades of traitorous officers. Following him, a different young man will step onto the historical stage, one who will survey the expanses of Asia Minor, Parthia, and Bactria lost by his father, swearing to restore their former glory. His name is Antiochus III. The story of how this king will march all the way to India, only to ultimately challenge the legions of the West, will become a legend that permanently changed the ancient world. Subscribe so you don't miss the era of Antiochus the Great. Hit the like button if the story of this paradoxical, victorious loser allowed you to look at the price of power in a new light. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was it worth it for Queen Laodice to pit her own sons against each other for control of Asia, or did this choice doom the state to the abyss from the very start? Thank you for watching. See you next time.